country's Revolutionary War rather than set up its government. His cousin, Lund Washington, was essential in overseeing the extensive renovations of Mount Vernon's mansion house during the Revolution while George Washington was absent, yet it was a personal service that came to an end several years before Washington became president, and by then Lund was going blind on the little piece of land that Washington had deeded him. Dr. James Craik's attachment to Washington was lengthy and durable, making Craik the oldest and possibly the dearest friend the squire of Mount Vernon ever had, but he did not touch on his presidency. All these and others are intriguing in their own ways, and each had a part in making George Washington into the man who became president, but they are not part of the story of his 8 years in the office, and the making of the presidency beyond the man. As a consequence, the criteria for the circle should be obvious. These are the people who had close involvement in the country's major events and who were intimately involved with Washington as a private and public figure during the opening years of the constitutional republic. They include the heads of executive departments, the secretaries who by 1793 were being collectively called the Cabinet. Alexander Hamilton at Treasury and Thomas Jefferson at the State Department figure prominently by this measure alone, but they made other contributions worth exploring as well, some superb, others much less so. Henry Knox would never be as celebrated as his colleagues, and for good reason, but he nevertheless cooked up the plan to pacify the Indians on the country's frontiers. Washington measured it as among his presidency's most significant initiatives, and it was the one he most closely superintended. Knox also had difficulties just as challenging as those of his associates. As the Secretary of War, Knox had to run a military department that lacked the military and cope with war scares that loomed and receded in a dangerous world. Edmund Randolph, as Attorney General and then Jefferson's successor at State, was a relative youth whose admiration of George Washington reflected Randolph's belief that his fellow Virginian was the greatest man he had ever known. Yet Randolph was no callow hero worshipper. He alone continued to understand the primary purpose and best methods of the executive branch as both colleagues and chief began to lose sight of one and falter in the other. Randolph reminded Washington of someone, at least before he reminded him of someone else, and the consequences of that transformation have the shadows of a Shakespearean tragedy. In addition to Washington's official family, there was his real one. The plain little widow he married was an unlikely match for the dashing militia colonel, but Washington saw something in Martha Custis from the start, and anyone with a trace of discernment would eventually see it as well. In Washington's home, Harvard man Tobias Lear was a rarity, the fixture not related by blood or marriage. Lear was, rather, the general's right-hand man, who became the first presidential secretary. His responsibilities were so extensive that they would beggar the most grinding workhorse's imagination, and he routinely rose to their challenges. Lear would also prove that, given the right temptations and the wrong circumstances, every man can disappoint. Outside of cabinet and household, advisers and extensions of Washington's executive authority were part of this indispensable circle. Even before the beginning of Washington's first term, James Madison was a trusted counselor who became Washington's unofficial prime minister, helping to set proper precedents and appropriate relations between executive and legislative branches. Their partnership was most remarkable, however, for how it slowly, painfully collapsed. Gouverneur Morris and John Jay were friends who Washington so trusted that he assigned them to delicate diplomatic missions crucial to the success of his presidency and the nation, yet they became victims of domestic divisions caused by worsening relations with France and Great Britain, forcing the president to desert one man and sustain the other. The political costs were significant. Martha Washington's grandchildren did not shape her husband's presidency, but they show us important things about the man, as do certain members of his family, such as Washington's mother and the nephew he entrusted with Mount Vernon's care when he left to become president. Members of the government who would